Hello, everyone. It's day 39, and today we're taking our piece of music to the next level, and we are taking those chords and putting them into parts. So at this point, you've thought about your form, you've picked a key, you've made a melody, you've assigned chords to go along with your melody. Now we need to write those parts out. Just like the guidelines with chords, keep in mind that it's okay to break the rules that we're going to go over. As an aside, I'm going to be using the term voice a lot. You can assume it means instrument, instrument family, part. It's just a generic term that's just going to lump all that kind of stuff together. So first, you need to decide who's going to get the melody. You can double it, giving it to more than one voice. You can pass it from one voice to another. You can have it be a solo at some points. It's really up to you. But you need to make that decision. Personally, I tend to prefer music where the melody is passed around, so that's the way I write my music. Maybe this is just because I'm a low brass guy and I spend a lot of time not playing the melody, but you should just be careful. If you're going to pass the melody around, you need to have it be in logical places. Don't just pass the melody in the middle of a phrase. It's doable, but it's tricky. The next thing you should probably do, what I do, is assign the bass line. Doesn't necessarily need to be in your lowest voice at all times, but that is an easy way to start. The reason I start with the bass line when I'm writing my harmonies, because it does a lot to set up the structure of the chords. Chords are chords? No. There's a big difference in the character of a chord just depending on which note of that chord is in the bass. We call this inverting the chords. So I'm going to play for you 3 chords. They're the same 3 notes. I'm just changing which note is on the bottom. The next thing you need to keep in mind is the distance from that bass note, and really to all the harmony notes from the melody. We refer to this as the chords being open or closed. If it's closed, there's less than an octave between the top note and the bass. Obviously, open, there's more than an octave. Here's an example. This is Mary Had a Little Lamb with closed harmonies. And now, Mary Had a Little Lamb with open chords. It makes a difference. So, once you've assigned your bass and your melody, it's time to fill out the parts. You can write so that the parts have the same rhythm as the melody, so the parts have the same rhythm, but that rhythm is different than the melody, that the parts all have different rhythms or any combination thereof. It's really up to you. Here are some rules that are going to help you with your part writing. Rule number 1, don't go outside of that voice's range. This should make sense. But if you're writing for instrumental music, don't write a note that instrument can't easily play. Or if you're going to write a hard note, think twice before you slap that note right in the beginning, especially if it's in the harmonies. If you're pushing that range in the harmonies, you're going to draw attention away from your melody a little bit too much. Rule number 2. This mostly applies when writing vocal music, but it is something to think about with instrumental as well. Don't create more than an octave between adjacent voices. So if you're thinking of vocal music, you don't want to create more than an octave between the soprano and the alto, okay? Or if you're thinking instrumental music, you probably don't want to create more than an octave, say, between your first trumpet and your second trumpet. Also, you really should avoid either overlapping or crossing the voices. Overlapping voices means going two voices going to the same note. Crossing voices means the lower voice goes higher than the higher voice. Number 3. This one is good advice for your bass line. You want to use contrary or oblique motion to the bass more frequently than you use similar motion. You want to use parallel motion only when you have to. So what that means is if your melody, say, is going up, you want your bass line to be going down. Or if your melody is saying static, have your bass line move either up or down, but not static with it. Only as a last resort should you have your bass line moving in parallel motion with your melody line. Rule number 4. This one's important and really easy to mess up. Never use parallel fifths. You should avoid too much unisons and octaves in parallels, but you should never write for parallel fifths. It just sounds wrong. Why? I don't know. It just does. Take a listen. What is tricky about this is it isn't just in the adjacent voices. It takes a keen eye to catch them when you're doing them. If you're listening back to your parts and something doesn't sound right, the first thing you should think to check is to see if you wrote any parallel fifths. Rule number 5, double a stable tone. If you need to double a note in a chord, say you're only using a triad but you're writing for 4 voices, you want to double the root or the fifth. You should never double the leading tone, also known as the 7th tone in a scale. Even if you're using a 7 chord, it just sounds unstable. Rule number 6, try to move to the closest chord tone. Try not to jump around too much. The big exception in this is if you're outlining a chord. Elsewise, you should try and keep your harmony parts to stepwise motion as much as possible. Rule number 7, related rule. If you're going to make jumps, try to make the interval either major, minor, or perfect. You want to avoid things like augmented and diminished intervals within a part. Rule number 8. A 7th should go to a tonic, especially if it's in an outer voice, say the bass or soprano. If it's in an inner voice, you can instead have it go to a 5th, but that can create a lot of tension. There are more rules. I'm going to include a link in the description of this video to the document that I used that helped me kind of organize my thoughts for this. But again, it's important to remember that these rules, it is okay to break them. Every rule in music writing should be followed by the words, except when. Because there's always a situation where you might want to break the rules. For my part writing, I try my best to make it so that every part sounds good on its own. If you play that part isolated and think to yourself, that's awkward, you probably want to rewrite it. If you listen to the parts together and don't like the way it sounds, rewrite it. There's a lot of trial and error to this. So we heard the melody that I previously wrote out, and we heard the chords that I put with it. Here's my first draft at the part writing to go with my melody. A reminder, here we are looking at the string piece that I was working on. This is the original version with the melody in the top line and just chords underneath it. This has been reworked just a little bit since the last time it was played for you. So here's a reminder of the piece I was working on. So that was the piece with its chords, or at least the first theme of it. So here on this tab, hope this works right, you now see I kept the piano part down there. It's exactly like what you were just looking at. Just kept it down there for make it easier to copy and paste and rearrange things. So as you can see here in the violin 1 part and the viola part, I have the melody in the beginning, and then it gets passed around to a little bit throughout the ensemble throughout. You can see the chords that I have set up. I did my best to catch any parallels because that's something that I mess up a lot. And I experimented a little bit in the different parts. So it's definitely not a finished product. I want to mess around with it some more. But this is what I came up with writing out the parts. So there's still a few spots in there that I'm not real happy with. In particular, some of my violin 2 parts I'm not extremely happy with. But overall, that's the kind of direction I'm taking with writing out the parts. So now you've seen how it works, all the way from the start, coming up with a concept to essentially a final project. Music writing's not that bad. It's a really great exercise, and some of you will really enjoy the creativity of writing the music. So that's it for today's video. You're definitely going to want to tune in to tomorrow's video. It is an interview with an active songwriter, singer-songwriter, good friend of mine. You're going to enjoy it. So I'll see you tomorrow. Have a good one. Be safe.